For us to begin, according to my watch, I usually like to start with a song, but this week and last week I didn't pick one out, so we'll just go ahead and get started and have a prayer at the end of the class. We are continuing our study in the book, in the Minor Prophets, and today we're going to be looking at Obadiah. And as I mentioned last week, we are taking these chronologically. Obadiah, notice I subtitled it, Judgment on Edom. Obadiah is written to a nation called Edom. And you see there on that slide a view down into a canyon of a temple that's carved into the side of a cliff. And that's a place called Petra. Have any of you been on tours to Petra? These are really popular. It's in the kingdom of Jordan. It's in an area that is similar to southern Utah. Southeastern Utah has a lot of canyons and red rocks and formations. And this one is actually a Greek and a Roman era, and it's called Petra. And you'll notice the map there. The nation of Edom stretches from the southern edge of the Dead Sea down to the northern edge of the Sea of Aqaba, which is that ear that you see on the right-hand side when you look at a map with the Sinai Peninsula in between the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aqaba. And the Dead Sea and the Gulf of Aqaba and the Red Sea on further down, and then into Africa around where Ethiopia is, and down almost to the Republic of South Africa is a huge rift. It's called the Great Rift. It's a big, huge crack in the earth, and the Jordan flows down that rift and into the Dead Sea, and then it gains altitude, and so the surface of the Dead Sea is like 1,268 feet below sea level. And then you climb up to about where that on that map Petra is. I don't know if this has a pointer or not. Yeah, it does. There's Petra, Dead Sea. This is called the Arabah. It's a huge valley. Somewhere in the middle, it starts sloping down this way, and the water that flows into it, what little water flows into it, goes into the Sea of Aqaba, and on the other side, it goes into the Dead Sea. It's very mountainous and rocky, a lot of canyons, and Selah in the Old Testament is also called the city of Seir, which was the capital of Edom at points, and then there were other places that were capitals of Edom. So what we're talking about is the kingdom of Edom, and you'll know from history that this is a view from down below at Petra. To get to Petra, you have to go through a slot canyon to get into that city. And many of the cities in Edom were built like what we would call cliff dwellings. And they were very difficult to attack and very difficult to overcome if they were your enemies. We'll talk a little more about that as we go. We're going to use the date 845 for the book of Obadiah. It's argued one way or the other by different people that it should be dated after the Babylonian exile, but we're going to use the date 845. In the time of Jehoram, the king Jehoram, Jerusalem was attacked and it was devastated, and they had the nation of Judah had control over Edom for a long time until that point, and then for a little while Edom was free, but then Judah overcame it again. The circumstances for this book are a destruction of Jerusalem, which I believe to be the destruction during Jehoram's time, the King Jehoram, which he ruled 853 to about 812. I think most of you know the background behind Edom, but for those that may not, I'm going to go over it. Edom is a nation that is descendant of Esau. Esau was the brother of Jacob, the twin brother of Jacob. He is the one that Jacob cheated out of his birthright and cheated out of his fatherly blessing. And so he, for fear of his life, and also to find a wife, so that kind of rhymes, for fear of his life and for his wife, he went to Haran and spent 20 years because he was afraid that Esau would kill him. And on his way back, after 20 years, he now has 12 children plus a daughter, 12 sons plus a daughter, and he's afraid that Esau is going to destroy him. So he prays, he puts gifts for Esau ahead of his troop. But Esau, at this point, I think is a wonderful example. He's forgiven. He accepts Jacob back without any harm or retribution. He against his will at first, he accepts Jacob's gifts, and so they live in peace together. But that's really pretty much the last thing that we know between the descendants of Jacob and the descendants of Esau that could be said that's good. From when the Israelites were coming into the Promised Land, from the 40 years of wilderness wandering, they asked Edom, can we pass through your land? We'll pay for any water, any food, any forage that we take. We just want to go through. We don't want your property. We want to just be at peace with each other and go through. Edom said, no, you can't go through. And so they went around Edom. The next nation that they had to go through was Moab. And they couldn't go through, they couldn't attack them either because they also were related through Lot. Moab and Ammon were the next two nations that the Israelites had to pass through to get into the Promised Land. And these two also were related to them through Lot. And so they had a lot of resistance from their own relatives. So if you have ever had resistance from your relatives, you know what I'm talking about. So there was always this tension between Judah and Edom. Sometimes Judah was the predominant one. Sometimes Edom was the predominant one. At the time that Obadiah has written, Judah has been destroyed, Jerusalem has been destroyed, but not by Edom directly. And so the reason for this letter is, or this prophecy, is to address the unbrotherly conduct of Edom. This is strictly directed toward the nation of Edom. In my translation, sometimes it uses Esau, meaning Edom, and sometimes other translations say Edom. Both of them mean the same thing. The theme is Edom is judged for cruel and unbrotherly conduct. God viewed that brotherly relationship between Esau and Jacob as a sacred thing, even after 300-400 years. I mean, they had been in Egyptian captivity, 40 years in the wilderness. I don't know how many generations that was from Jacob to the time of Obadiah, but God still viewed those brotherly relationships as sacred, as important. The Israelites were not allowed to attack Edom in order to get into the promised land. They were not allowed to attack Moab in order to get into the promised land, nor were they allowed to attack Ammon. So God considers that familial relationship as a really important, long-lasting relationship. So let's start. The message is God rules the nations. As we continue in the minor prophets, it's going to be hard for me at times not to be political. I'll try to, but God doesn't just rule Israel. He doesn't just rule Judah. God rules all nations, and He holds all nations accountable for their actions. And nations have characters. If you went somewhere and said, "What's America like? What are Americans like?" I'm not sure you'd be happy with the answer. A lot of times, we are guilty of promoting some things that we, ungodliness and attitudes toward people that's not good. And I won't go any further with that, but as we go through the minor prophets, we're going to talk about nations and why nations are judged and what kinds of judgments nations experience as a result of the sinfulness of those nations. And it's important for us to be lights and salt in this nation, because God, for a few, will preserve a lot. Like in the case of Lot in Sodom and Gomorrah, if God could have found 10 people that were righteous, those two cities would have been not destroyed. But all he could find was Lot and his wife turned her back as they were leaving. So let's get to the book of Obadiah. I'm not going to put a lot of scriptures on the screen, partly because of time factor, but also because we're going to be in this book, and I'll put a few verses up, but they will be verses that are outside of the book of Obadiah. Starting in verse 1, the vision of Obadiah. Thus says the Lord God. And that's all over the prophetic literature. Thus says the Lord God. Jehovah, the Lord Jehovah, concerning Edom. So we know who it's addressed to. We have heard a report from the Lord, from Jehovah, and an envoy has been sent among the nations, saying, Arise, and let us go against her, that is Edom, for battle. Behold, I will make you small among the nations. You are greatly despised. The arrogance of your heart has deceived you. You who lived in the clefts of the rock, in the loftiness of your dwelling place, who say in your heart, Who will bring me down to earth? Though you build high like the eagle, though you set your nest among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord. If thieves came to you, if robbers by night, oh, how you would be ruined. Would they not steal only until they had enough? If grape gatherers came to you, would they not leave some gleanings? Oh, how Esau will be ransacked, and his hidden treasures searched out. All the men allied with you will send you forth to the border, and the men at peace with you will deceive you and overpower you. They who eat your bread will set an ambush for you. There is no understanding in him. I will not on that day, declares the Lord, will I not on that day, declares the Lord, destroy wise men from Edom and understanding from the mountain of Esau? Then your mighty men will be dismayed, O Teman, so that everyone may be cut off from the mountain of Esau by slaughter. So he starts with the not saying exactly why he's going to do this, but he talks about the destruction that is coming, the judgment that is coming. And notice he says, the day of the Lord is coming. That expression will be used later, but down in verse 8, will I not on that day? Some people say that the book of Obadiah's theme is the day of the Lord. I'm going to reserve that for Joel because he uses that expression more than Obadiah does. But down in verse 15, he says, for the day of the Lord draws near on all nations. As you have done, it will be done to you. Your dealings will return on your own head. So Obadiah talks about the judgment that's coming. He talks about the reason the judgment's coming. And then he goes back to the judgment and talks about it for a while. He says, don't be so proud of your defenses. He says, if you'll notice the defenses, the loftiness of your dwelling, how you set your nest high in the stars. He's talking about this terrain that they're a part of, the cliff dwellings, and they would build their cities up high so that they would be very difficult to attack. And as long as they had food, usually they could outlast a siege if someone put them under siege. But to actually attack the city would be very, very difficult because of the cliffs and those narrow passageways like the one that we see here into the city of Petra. That's a very easy access to the city to protect and guard. And so one of their defenses is, and one of the things that they're proud of, is their indestructibility. They can't be destroyed. And you know, sometimes we get the idea, well, we're separated by the Pacific and the Atlantic from other countries, and you know, we're impregnable. Nobody's impregnable if the Lord chooses to judge you. And they trusted in their defenses. They also trusted, they were arrogant in that trust. They also trusted in their treasures. Verse 6, how Esau will be ransacked in the hidden treasures. And so God is going to take away the things that they trust in. In the latter part of verse 8, and the understanding from the mountain of Esau. So they also trusted in their wisdom. They were known as being, or reputed to be, wise people. And if you remember, Esau is a descendant, Eliphaz is a descendant of Esau. And he had a son named Teman. So there was a city in Edom called Teman. And if you look at the book of Job, one of the three people that was the wise people that tried to comfort Job, one of them was Eliphaz, the father of Teman. And he was supposed to be a wise man. We think he's probably we know that Eliphaz is the grandson of Esau, and we think that might be the same person that's mentioned in Job. And so they trusted in their wisdom. They trusted in their wealth. They trusted in their mighty men. In verse 9, your mighty men will be dismayed. They also trusted in their allies. Verse 7, all the men allied with you will send you forth to the border, and the men at peace with you will deceive you and overpower you. You know, it's not wise to, if you're an ungodly nation, it's not wise to trust in the people that you ally with. Because why are they allying themselves with you? Is it for your benefit? For their benefit? You know, sometimes allies, the nation of Israel trusted in Egypt. And when the time came for Egypt to come to their aid, they weren't there. And then in the book of Revelation, when it's talking about the destruction of Rome, they had allies, and the allies would mourn and grieve, not because Rome was gone, but because their income was suffering. So we have to be careful about the allies that we trust in. He says, your destruction is irrevocable and it's total. Starting in verse 5, he says, if thieves came to you, if robbers by night, how you would be ruined. Would they not steal only until they had enough? If grape gatherers come to you, would they not leave some gleaning? So the picture here is if someone breaks into your house, they're not going to load up a U-Haul and take everything you've got. Usually, they'll look around, find what they think is valuable, grab it, and run so they won't get caught. And the other image here is the grape gatherers. You go through a field or a vineyard and you start picking grapes, and can you miss some? Yeah. And God told the Israelites, don't go back a second time. Just go through one time and leave what's left, what you couldn't see, what you didn't see, for the poor. And same thing with wheat field or any kind of a field. The first time you gather everything that you can see, but don't go by the second time and keep going through until you gather everything. Leave something for the poor. Well, this is the image that he's saying here. If a grape gatherer comes through the vineyard, there's going to be things that weren't seen, things that were dropped, grapes that were dropped on the ground. And he's saying, your destruction's not going to be like that. Your destruction's not going to be partial. There's not going to be things left. In verse 6, he says, oh, how Esau will be ransacked and his hidden treasures searched out. All the men allied with you will send you forth to the border, and the men at peace with you will deceive you and overpower you. So he's saying, when this happens to you, there's not going to be anything left. There's not going to be any gleanings. There's not going to be things left that the thief didn't want. They're going to take everything. So it's a very serious and horrible kind of judgment. Verse 8 says, will I not on that day the Lord destroy wise men from Edom and understanding from the mountain of Esau? That's a rhetorical question. What's the answer? Yeah, I'm going to do it. This cannot be averted. Your mighty men will be dismayed, O Teman, so that everyone may be cut off from the mountain of Esau by slaughter. So he's saying, this is going to happen. You can count on it. Don't take bets that it's not, because you're going to lose. God says this is going to be total, and it will happen. Starting in verse 10, he tells them why this is happening. It's not only because of their arrogance, it's not only because of their trust in things that are not trustworthy, but it's because of some things that they did. He says, verse 10 through 14, because of violence to your brother Jacob, you will be covered with shame, and you will be cut off forever. On the day that you stood aloof, on the day that the strangers carried off his wealth, and foreigners entered his gate, and cast lots for Jerusalem, you too were as one of them. Do not gloat over your brother's day, the day of his misfortune, and do not rejoice over the sons of Judah in the day of their destruction. Yes, do not boast in the day of their distress. Do not enter the gate of my people in the day of their disaster. Yes, you do not gloat over their calamity in the day of their disaster, and do not loot their wealth in the day of their disaster. Do not stand at the fork of the road to cut down the fugitives, and do not imprison their survivors in the day of their distress. Note that repetition, in the day of their distress, in the day of their distress, in the day of their distress. So why is it that Edom's going to be judged? First of all, they watched their brothers go down without helping. They stood neutral and stood by while another nation attacked their brothers and attacked the city of their brothers, Jerusalem, and looted them. So they were not active in that process, were they? They were just standing by and not helping. But they were not helping their brothers. They were not helping someone that they had a relationship with through Abraham, Isaac. He says in verse 10, he says in verse 10, because of your violence to your brother, you will be covered with shame. They weren't violent to their brother, were they? They weren't participating, but the fact that they didn't help equaled violence to their brother. By not helping, they were being violent to their brother. They were allowing the violence. In verse 11, you too were as one of them. Even though you stood by and watched while the bullies were beating up your brother, you were as if you were one of the bullies beating up your brother. So to stand by and watch our brothers or our Lord be talked badly about or misrepresented, and to not say something, and to not protect that relationship between our brother Jesus and our other brothers, we are adopted, but is to be violent and as if we were doing the same thing. He says, you watched with pleasure. You watched your brother being abused and you were happy about it. He said, you gloat over your brother, verse 12. In this section, he's talking about what they did, but he's talking about it as if they were going to do it. Because he says, do not gloat over your brother. That's a command. But it's a command that's addressed to something they've already done, which is common in prophetic writings. He says, don't gloat over your brother. Yes, don't boast in the latter part of verse 12. So they gloated over that. In Proverbs, I think it's 17. Let me see if I can find it. Sorry, it's not where I thought it was. There's a passage that says when your enemy is judged, you're not to be happy about that. You're not to be happy about what has happened to them. Your attitude should be, God's will be done. I hope it brings them to understand their position and repent. But you don't gloat and be happy that your enemies have been hurt or destroyed. He says, you trespassed on their land. He's in verse 12, verse 11. On that day you stood aloof, on the day that the strangers took off his wealth. That's not the Edomites. It's not the Jewish people. And foreigners entered his gate and cast lots for Jerusalem. You too were as one of them. The day, in verse 12, the day of his misfortune, do not rejoice over the sons of Judah in the day of their destruction. Yes, do not boast in the day of their distress. Do not enter the gate of my people in the day of their disaster. Yes, you do not gloat over the calamity in the day of their disaster, and do not loot their wealth in the day of their disaster. So apparently, when this happened, after the other army left, they went in and looted the country and took what the original nation that destroyed Edom left. They took the gleanings. They cleaned them out. And then in verse 14, you looted their belongings, which I just mentioned. Do not stand at the fork of the road. Anytime a nation is under attack and losing territory, there are always refugees. In February 22, when Ukraine was attacked, there were refugees. The roads were lined up with people trying to get out of the war zone and go into Poland and Albania and all the countries surrounding. And these people are very vulnerable. We've seen pictures of the refugees in the Korean clogging up the roads. It was hard for the military to move because of refugees. And so here's what's happening in this situation. The refugees are coming to the border of Esau, trying to get away from the problems in Judah, and the Edomites are meeting them, and some of them they're killing. It says, do not cut down their fugitives, and do not imprison their survivors in the day of their distress. So some of the people they are killing, and some of the people they're taking captive and selling as slaves or keeping them for themselves as slaves. So notice the progression. At first, they're just standing by watching. Then they're happy about what's going on. And then they invade the territory and take their things, loot the people. And then they meet them at the border and either kill and or take them slave. So that's progression of sin in our lives. If we allow something to be something that we just kind of look over or put it aside and say, that's not a big deal. It will progress into something worse, and then something worse, and then something worse. So we need to guard ourselves from allowing anything that would taint us and keep us from being the kind of Christian that Jesus wants us to be. Otherwise, those things continue to plague us and get worse and worse. In the next section, verses 15 through 21, he talks about more about the judgment, but in this section, he begins to make a distinction between Judah, who has been devastated, and Edom, who stood by and watched. He says, "For the day of the Lord draws near on all nations. As you have done, it will be done to you. Your dealings will return on your own head. Because just as you drank on my holy mountain, all the nations will drink continually. They will drink and swallow and become as if they had never existed. But on Mount Zion, there will be those who escape. And it, Mount Zion, will be holy, and the house of Jacob will possess their possessions. Then the house of Jacob will be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame. But the house of Esau will be as stubble, and they will set them on fire and consume them, so that there will be no survivor of the house of Esau. For the Lord has spoken. Then those of the Negev, that is the south, will possess the mountain of Esau, and those of the Shephelah, the Philistine plain, also possess the territory of Ephraim and the territory of Samaria, and Benjamin will possess Gilead. And the exiles of this host of the sons of Israel, who are among the Canaanites as far as Zarephath, and the exiles of Jerusalem, who are in Sepharad, will possess the cities of the Negev. The deliverers will ascend Mount Zion to judge the mountain of Esau, and the kingdom will be the Lord's. The kingdom will be Jehovah's." So this finishes with a beautiful note about the overcoming of evil by God's people. He says, first of all, the day is near. The day of the Lord is near. Now, a lot of times when we read the day of the Lord, we think, and a lot of people think of the final coming of Jesus, which is also called the second coming. And I'll explain why I use the expression the final coming as opposed to the second coming in a later lesson. Next week we'll study Joel, and the theme of his book is the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord is an expression that in the Old Testament is only used by the prophets. You don't find it before Obadiah in time. You don't find it anywhere in the Pentateuch or the history of Israel. It's only in the prophets. Here he says it's near. Now, if we make that the end of time, we're at least 2,900 years later. Can we call that near? And near means near to the people he's talking to. Not, sometimes people say, well, one day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day to God. Well, he's not talking to God. God is talking to people. And he says it's near. He also says all nations here. Well, how are we supposed to understand that? All nations? Was he talking about the Indians in North America? Was he talking about the Indians in India? Was he talking about the Indians and the natives of Siberia. No, he's talking about all of the nations that are influenced by and have an influence on Edom. When a nation falls, it has a ripple effect. You know, we talk about a global economy. They also had economic and political and military relationships with other people. And this is difficult to explain, but let me give a passage here. For the day is near, even the day of the Lord is near. It will be a day of clouds, a time of doom for the nations. That's Ezekiel 30, verse 3. And what's he talking about in that chapter? He's talking about destruction on Egypt. But he uses all nations, and he uses the term all day of the Lord. So we as we go through this study, I hope we have a clear understanding of what those two concepts are. O Jacob, my servant, do not fear, declares the Lord, for I am with you. For I will make a full end of all the nations where I have driven you. Yet I will not make a full end of you, that is, Judah, but I will correct you properly and by no means leave you unpunished. So here he uses the expression all nations again. But he's talking about nations that have a relationship and an impact and an effect on the nation of Judah. That's Jeremiah's message. I think again, this is a difficult concept, and I hope as we go through we can develop it. The basic principle is, as you have done, it will be done to you. Your dealings will return on your own head. You sow the wind, and what do you reap? The wind? You reap something more, the whirlwind. And that's the concept that's throughout the Bible. You reap what you sow. And that is an expression right here. That's the significance of that expression. He says, Edom will burn. Verse 18, then the house of Jacob will be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame, but the house of Esau will be as stubble. We know about wildfires. You take a field of wheat that's been cut, and it's dry, and start a fire. If there's a wind, it's gone, and it doesn't take long. When they fired clay pots, they would put big logs in first, and it was slow fire, and then build up the heat, and the last thing they would do is throw in stubble. It burned up quick and very hot. So fire throughout the prophets and even into New Testament times is a figure of God's judgment. Remember when Peter got up and said, "This is what Joel spoke of," and he used a quote from Joel and talks about the fire coming. So we'll be seeing that more often in these books about fire. It's always God's judgment on the nation. Then those of the Negev, verse 19. He talks about a number of places here. The Negev is, if you go back to that map, is the south, down toward the tip of the Sinai, and it is where the Nabateans lived, and then also the Shephelah is the foothills up in Judah, and Ephraim and Samaria. What he's saying is, you're going to cease to exist because those people from the north, from the south, are going to come in and take over your land and take your place. He says, the exiles of Jerusalem, and some of those exiles are the ones that Edom had taken captive at the border and sold into slavery. But God says, the exiles of Jerusalem who are in Sepharad will possess the cities of the Negev. The deliverers will ascend Mount Zion. Jerusalem, that is Zion, will be exalted. In the day of David, he established his palace on Zion. The temple was on Mount Moriah. And Zion became a figure of the dwelling place of God. And it became something that was, and we sing it today, on Zion's glorious summit stood. And Zion is a figure of God's place, where God dwells. It's God's city. And so what he's saying here is, my people cannot be destroyed. No nation can attack God's nation, God's people, and at some point not be judged. These people are going to be judged not because they attacked, but because they were happy it was attacked. They stood by and watched. He says, deliverers will ascend Mount Zion to judge the mountain of Esau, and the kingdom will be the Lord's. So the kingdom, he says, deliverers will ascend Mount Zion to judge the mountain of Esau, and the kingdom will be the Lord's. Obadiah 21. The kingdom is more, we talk about the church being the kingdom. The kingdom is more than the church. It includes angels. It includes Abraham. It includes, I'm going to read, to finish up, I'll read a very, very important passage, which I'll read frequently in this series. And I hope you don't get tired of that, but it's important. He says, they were in Hebrews chapter 12, he's talking about how the people in the wilderness were afraid when they saw the mountain that Moses went up on, and how there was thunder and lightning and darkness. He says, but you Christians, have come to Mount Zion. I'm in verse 22. And to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to myriads of angels, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn, who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood, which speaks better than the blood of Abel. That's where we are if we're in Christ. We are in Zion. We are in the New Jerusalem. We are in a kingdom that cannot be shaken. So, thank you.